She was 19 years old, and by the autumn of 1891 she owned nothing in the world but a carpet bag, a dead father's pocket watch, and $11 folded into the lining of her boot. Her name was Delia Marsh, and the man who cast her out was her own uncle, Whitcomb Marsh, who had taken over her father's shipping ledger after the fever swept through and decided a girl of 19 was one mouth too many to feed for charity's sake. He gave her a week to find lodging and a livelihood, and when the week ended, he set her carpetbag on the porch and locked the door behind her without so much as a backward glance. $11 was what stood between Delia and the winter. So when a county auctioneer in the town of Cormorant Point called out the old lighthouse keeper's cottage, abandoned these 11 years, its lens gone dark, its garden gone a bramble, and nobody in the crowd so much as lifted a finger, Delia raised her hand and bid the whole of what she had, $4. The auctioneer laughed, but he took her money because nobody else wanted a crumbling cottage on a forgotten spit of rock. What Delia did not know, what she could not have known, standing there in the salt wind with the deed trembling in her hand, was that behind the built-in shelves of that cottage's back room lay something sealed away for over a decade, something that would not only save her life, but would give an entire fishing town back what the sea had taken from it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delia Marsh. If you've ever felt like the whole world quietly decided you were worth less than nothing, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Delia had not always been poor. She had been raised in Belhaven, a modest coastal town 2 days' ride south of Cormorant Point, in a narrow clapboard house that smelled of tar rope and lamp oil, because her father, Josiah Marsh, had been a shipping clerk who loved to see the way other men loved scripture. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, and he taught Delia to read a ledger before she could properly read a novel, walking her through columns of debits and credits at the kitchen table by lamplight while her mother, Ruth, hummed hymns over the mending basket. Ruth Marsh had a gift for taking apart broken things and finding what still worked inside them, an old clock, a torn coat, a cracked teapot, and she raised Delia to believe that very little in this world was truly ruined, only overlooked, only waiting for someone patient enough to look twice. Nothing is finished just because it looks finished, her mother used to say, turning a chipped china cup in her hands until the light caught some hidden grace in it. You have to ask what a thing was for and whether it can still be that. Delia absorbed this the way children absorb the deepest lessons, without knowing she was learning anything at all, simply by watching her mother's hands. Her father, meanwhile, gave her a different gift, patience with numbers and a stubborn honesty about them. He worked for the Belhaven Maritime Trading Company, keeping records of cargo manifests, insurance claims, and the endless small disputes between captains and merchants over what had been lost at sea and what had merely been misplaced on a dock somewhere. He would bring his ledgers home sometimes, and Delia, 12 and then 14 and then 16, would sit beside him tracing her finger down the columns, learn to spot the places where numbers didn't quite agree with themselves, a discrepancy of a few dollars here, a shipment log twice there. A ledger doesn't lie, her father told her once, but a man can make it look like it's lying about something else, to hide what he doesn't want seen. He said this lightly, almost as a joke, not knowing how much it would matter to his daughter one day. Delia's childhood was not without hardship even then. 2 brothers died in infancy before she was born, and her mother carried a quiet grief for them that surfaced sometimes in the middle of ordinary afternoons, a sudden stillness over the wash basin. But there was enough love in that small house to make up for what was missing, and Delia grew up believing that a family's worth was not measured in silver, but in how carefully its members tended one another. She was 17 when her mother caught a lung fever in a wet December and did not recover by spring. Delia nursed her through the worst of it, learned the rhythms of sickroom, learned to boil rags and change linens, and sit through the long nights holding a hand that grew thinner every week. When Ruth Marsh finally passed, it was Delia who closed her eyes, and something in the girl hardened and steadied all at once, the way greenwood hardens when it is finally seasoned by fire. Her father did not long outlive her mother. He tried, for Delia's sake, to keep the house and the routine going, but grief sat on him like a stone, and within 2 years a fever season took him too, quick and merciless, the same fever that emptied so many houses along that stretch of coast that autumn. Delia was left at 19 with a small inheritance, a stack of her father's ledgers she could not bear to sell, and an uncle, Whitcomb Marsh, who arrived from 3 towns over to settle the estate and see to the girl's welfare, as family was expected to do. Whitcomb was Josiah's younger brother, a man who had spent his life resenting that his elder brother had inherited the family's good name and steady employment, while he himself drifted from venture to venture, always one bad investment behind. He saw in his brother's small estate, the house, the modest savings, the shipping company shares, an opportunity to finally right what he considered a lifelong imbalance. He moved into the Belhaven house within a month of Josiah's funeral, declared himself Delia's guardian, though she was nearly of age, and began quietly transferring what little money there was into accounts and ventures of his own, all under the reasonable-sounding banner of managing the estate. Delia, grieving and unpracticed in the ways men like her uncle operated, did not understand at first what was happening. She only noticed slowly that the household grew leaner, that Whitcomb spoke of her father's shares with a proprietary tone that unsettled her, and that when she asked to see the ledgers her father had kept so carefully, her uncle grew short-tempered and evasive. It was in trying to understand this evasiveness that Delia's old education came back to her. She began quietly at night to go through what remained of her father's papers, cross-referencing the little she could find against what Whitcomb told her about the state of the estate. What she found chilled her, numbers that did not agree with themselves, some that had been logged and then altered, a pattern her father himself might have flagged in another man's books within minutes. Her uncle was not merely managing the estate. He was hollowing it out. When Delia confronted him, carefully, respectfully, laying out what she had found rather than simply accusing him, Whitcomb's face went through several expressions before settling on cold fury. He told her she understood nothing of business, that a girl's suspicions were not evidence, and that she ought to be grateful for a roof over her head at all given how little use she was to anyone. The conversation ended with him informing her, 3 days later, that he had decided the house was to be sold, that her father's remaining shares had already been restructured in ways that left her very little, and that she would need to find her own situation, as he could not be expected to support a grown woman indefinitely. It was, Delia understood even then, not really about money at all. It was that she had seen him clearly, and he could not forgive her for it. She left Belhaven with what she could carry, the carpet bag, a few keepsakes, her father's pocket watch, which Whitcomb had somehow overlooked or not thought valuable enough to claim, and $11 she had managed to set aside from small mending and letter-writing work she'd taken in the months since her father's death, never trusting her uncle enough to let him know she had saved it. She took a coach north along the coast road, not entirely sure where she was going, only that she could not stay in a town where every face reminded her of what had been taken from her. The coach let her off, eventually, in Cormorant Point, a fishing town built along a rocky harbor, because she had heard there was cheap lodging to be found near the old auction yard, and cheap was, by then, the only kind of lodging she could consider. It was pure chance that brought her to the auction that day. She had gone to inquire about a room above a chandlery, and found instead a small crowd gathered at the edge of the harbor road, where the county was disposing of properties seized or abandoned for unpaid taxes over the years. Delia, curious and cold and in no hurry to face the chandlery's asking price, drifted to the edge of the crowd to listen, the way a woman with nowhere pressing to be will often listen to whatever is happening nearby. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Corwin Blythe, who ran most of the county's small disposals, worked his way through a handful of properties: a burned-out net shed, a strip of marsh no one wanted, a half-collapsed barn, before he came to the last item on his list. Lighthouse keeper's cottage, he called out, consulting his paper without much enthusiasm. Out on Gull Point, attached to the old Cormorant Light. Property's been in county hands since old Ezra Colton's widow passed in '79, and no can ever claimed it. Structure's sound enough, they tell me, though it sat empty a long spell. Do I hear a bid? Nobody spoke. Delia looked out toward the harbor mouth, where she could just make out, past the fishing boats and the gray chop of the water, a squat white tower standing dark and unlit on a rocky point, a small cottage huddled at its base like a child sheltering against a parent's leg. The lighthouse itself, someone in the crowd murmured, had been decommissioned years back. When the new steel-frame light went up on the far headland, its old Fresnel lens removed and shipped off, its keeper's post abolished, leaving the cottage to the gulls and the weather. Nobody bid, because nobody in Cormorant Point had any use for a cottage on a spit of rock a mile from town, reachable only by a rough causeway path that flooded at high tide, attached to a lighthouse that no longer even served its purpose. "Come now," Blythe called again, a little impatient. "For dollars takes a lot, structure and land both, and saves the county the trouble of tearing it down. For dollars." And Delia, who had $11 to her name and nowhere in the world to spend the night, found her hand rising before she had fully decided to raise it. "For dollars," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. There was a ripple of soft laughter through the crowd, not unkind exactly, but a laughter people who assumed a young woman traveling alone with a carpetbag had simply misunderstood what she was bidding on. Blythe himself looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to take her seriously, before shrugging and calling out, "Sold to the young lady for $4, because business was business, and her coin was as good as anyone's." Delia counted the money into his palm with hands that trembled slightly, whether from cold or nerve she could not entirely say, and was handed a deed that felt absurdly light for something that was, as of that moment, entirely and legally hers. She walked the mile-long causeway path out to Gull Point that same afternoon, before the tide could turn and strand her, her carpetbag banging against her leg, gulls wheeling and crying overhead in a sky the color of dull pewter. The cottage, when she reached it, was smaller and sadder than it looked from town, a low structure of gray shingle and white trim gone to peeling, its garden a tangle of sea grass and bramble roses gone wild, one shutter hanging loose and creaking with each gust off the water. But the door, when she pushed it open, gave way without much resistance, and inside she found 4 modest rooms, dusty and cold but dry, the old iron stove still standing in the kitchen, a few pieces of heavy, water-stained furniture left behind, because no one had thought them worth hauling away. It was, Delia told herself that first night, wrapped in her one blanket on a dusty settee with the wind moaning around the eaves and the lighthouse tower, creaking faintly above her, the most foolish purchase a sensible woman could make. She had spent more than a third of everything she had on a crumbling cottage a mile from the nearest neighbor, with no clear way to earn a living, no company but gulls, and winter coming on fast off the water. And yet, and this she could not quite explain even to herself, there was something in the stubborn, weather solidity of the place, in a way it simply stood there through 11 years of storms and neglect, refuse and fall down, that reminded her powerfully of her mother's chipped teacups and mended coats. Nothing is finished just because it looks finished. She fell asleep to that thought and to the low, endless conversation of the sea against the rocks below. It was on her 3rd day at the cottage, while sweeping years of dust and dead leaves in the back room that had evidently served as the keeper's study, that Delia noticed something odd about the built-in shelving along the far wall. The shelves themselves were unremarkable, sturdy pine, holding a scatter of abandoned odds and ends, a cracked oil lamp, a coil of rotted rope, a few tins gone to rust. But as she ran her hand along the lowest shelf to clear a grit, she felt the wood shift very slightly beneath her palm, a give that solid, well-built shelving ought not to have. She knelt and examined it more closely in the gray light from the window, and saw what years of dust and neglect had disguised. The lowest shelf was not fixed to the wall at all, but sat in a shallow groove, free to be lifted, and behind it the wall itself showed a seam that did not match the rest of the paneling, as though a section of it had been built specifically to conceal something rather than simply to hold books. Her father's voice came back to her then, unbidden, the way it did at odd moments still. A ledger doesn't lie, but a man can make it look like it's lying about something else, to hide what he doesn't want seen. And though this was wood and not paper, the same instinct rose in her, the old patient curiosity her mother had planted and her father had sharpened. She worked her fingers into the seam and, after long minutes of careful prying, felt the panel give way to reveal a shallow cavity built into the wall itself, dry and undisturbed, holding a tin dispatch box gone dull with age, a bundle of oilcloth-wrapped papers, and tucked beside them a small leather-bound logbook whose cover bore, in faded gilt lettering, the words Cormorant Point Light, Keeper's Record. Delia sat back on her heels in the failing afternoon light and understood, with a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold, that she had just found what someone, many years ago, had gone to great trouble to hide. She did not open the logbook that first evening. Her hands were too unsteady and the light too poor, and some instinct told her this was not a discovery to be rushed. She built up what fire she could in the old stove, ate a meager supper of bread and dried fish she'd carried from town, and set the tin box and its contents on the kitchen table where she could watch them, as though they might otherwise vanish in the night. It was only the next morning, with gray daylight pouring through the salt fog window and a cup of chicory coffee warming her hands, that she finally opened the keeper's logbook and began, slowly, to read. The entries began in 1868 and were written in a careful, educated hand belonging to Ezra Colton, the lighthouse keeper the auctioneer had mentioned, and for the first many pages they recorded exactly what such a log ought to, whether ship traffic, the routine maintenance of the lamp and lens, the small dramas of a solitary post, a fishing boat guided safely through fog, a barrel of oil delivered late, a winter storm that stripped shingles from the roof. But as Delia read on into the entries from 1874 and 1875, the tone shifted. Ezra Colton began writing, in increasingly troubled language, about a series of wrecks along the rocks near Gull Point. 3 ships lost within 18 months, an unusual and suspicious number for waters he knew intimately, waters his light was meant to protect. He wrote of noticing, on several occasions, that the light itself had failed at critical hours through no fault of his own maintenance, as though something or someone had interfered with it. He wrote, with mounting unease, of a name, Silas Pruitt, a wealthy merchant and part owner of the very shipping insurance company that covered 2 of the wrecked vessels, a man who stood to profit handsomely from ships lost at sea rather than delivered safely to port. The logbook's final entries, dated the spring of 1876, grew sparse and guarded, as though Ezra Colton feared the book itself might be read by unfriendly eyes. He wrote that he had gathered proof, correspondence, shipping manifests, insurance filings, that Silas Pruitt had been deliberately sabotaging the Cormorant Point light on nights when doomed vessels, ones insured well above their worth, were due to pass, collecting handsomely on the resulting claims while sailors drowned in the wreckage. He wrote that he intended to bring this evidence to the county magistrate, but that he trusted no one in town enough to carry it there safely, given how much money and influence Pruitt commanded in Cormorant Point by then. The oilcloth bundle beside the logbook, Delia now understood as she unwrapped it with careful fingers, contained precisely that evidence. Copies of shipping manifests, a handful of letters in a hand she did not recognize discussing arrangements for certain voyages, and a set of insurance claim documents bearing the name of Pruitt's company, all of it corroborating exactly what the keeper had written. The last entry in the logbook, dated a bare week before the record ended altogether, was different from the rest, shorter, almost resigned. Ezra Colton had written that he feared for his safety, that strange things had been happening around the cottage at night, and that he had decided to hide the evidence rather than carry it, in case he never had the chance to see it delivered himself. If anyone finds this, he had written, in a hand grown suddenly urgent, let them know that 3 ships and their crews did not sink by God's will, but by a man's greed, and let the town of Cormorant Point finally have its truth. There was no entry after that. County records, Delia would later learn from the town clerk, showed only that Ezra Colton had died that same year of what was recorded as a fall from the lighthouse gallery, ruled an accident, and that the light had passed to a series of indifferent keepers before being decommissioned altogether a decade later. The old cottage left a molder, its secret seal behind a shelf that no one had ever thought to move. Delia sat with the logbook and its evidence for a long while that morning, the cottage creaking around her in the wind, and felt the full weight of what she had stumbled into. This was not simply an old man's private grievance. If what Ezra Colton had recorded was true, then somewhere in Cormorant Point there might still be a family named Pruitt living comfortably on money made from drowned sailors, while the widows and orphans of those same sailors had gone on, for nearly 2 decades, believing the sea alone had taken their men. She thought of her own father, and of the honest, careful way he had kept his ledgers, and of her Uncle Wickham, who had shown her exactly how far a man's greed could reach when he believed no one was watching closely enough to stop him. She thought, too, of her mother's hands turning a chipped teacup, finding grace in what others had written off. Nothing is finished just because it looks finished. She had bought a ruin for $4, and inside it she found a debt to the dead that someone eventually was going to have to pay. It took Delia the better part of a week, working carefully and quietly, to make sense of everything the keeper's evidence implied, and longer still to work up the courage to act on it. She began cautiously by asking questions in town, at the chandlery, at the small church, at the harbor where the fishing boats came in each evening, framing her curiosity as simple interest in the history of the cottage she now owned. In this way, she learned that the Pruitt family was indeed still prominent in Cormorant Point. Silas Pruitt himself had died some years back, but his son, Harlan Pruitt, had inherited both the family's insurance concerns and its considerable local influence, and sat now as a trustee of the very county board that had, ironically, auctioned off the cottage that held his father's secret. She learned, too, gently and by careful listening, which families in town had lost men to the sea in the years Ezra Colton's law described. The Ferris family, who had lost a husband and elder son aboard the Marguerite in 1874, old Mrs. Doyle, whose only boy had drowned when the content went down on the rocks that same terrible year, and several others whose names Delia began, without quite meaning to write down in a notebook of her own, the way her father had once taught her to track every discrepancy until the full pattern showed itself. Word travels quickly in a small harbor town. However, it was not long before Harlan Pruitt heard that the strange young woman who had bought the old Lighthouse cottage was asking pointed questions about old shipwrecks and old insurance claims. He came to call on her himself one gray afternoon, arriving at the cottage in a fine black coat entirely unsuited to the causeway mud, and introduced himself with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He had heard, he said, that she'd found some old papers of the former keepers, sentimental rubbish most likely, and he'd be glad to take them off her hands and see them properly disposed of, given his family's long connection to the light. Delia, standing in her own doorway with the wind pulling at her hair, told him politely that she found nothing of importance, only weather logs and old maintenance records, and that she intended to keep them as a curiosity of the cottage's history. Harlan Pruitt smiled thinned considerably at that, and he left with a warning thinly disguised as friendly advice, that a young woman alone on an isolated point ought to be careful about which old stories she went digging into, as such digging had a way of causing trouble for everyone involved. Delia understood the threat for exactly what it was, and in the days that followed she found small, unsettling signs that she was being watched. A gate left open as she was certain she had closed, footprints in the mud along the causeway path that were not her own, a lantern-light glimpse once at the tower's base long after dark when she had gone to bed alone. She thought, more than once, of Ezra Colton's final entry, of a fall from the gallery ruled an accident, and understood that she was standing exactly where a man had once stood and paid for his honesty with his life. But she thought, too, of her mother's steady hands and her father's honest columns, and of Mrs. Doyle's drowned boy, and of a whole town that had grieved for 18 years without ever knowing the true shape of what it grieved. She decided, in the quiet of the cottage with the sea moaning below, that she would not be frightened into silence the way Ezra Colton had ultimately been silenced. She would simply be smarter about how she carried the truth than he had been. Delia spent the next several days making careful copies of every document in the oilcloth bundle, working late by lamplight, cross-referencing dates and names with the patients her father had drilled into her at that kitchen table in Belhaven, until she had built, in her own clear hand, a second ledger that laid the entire scheme out plainly enough for any honest magistrate to follow, rather than carry the originals into town herself, where Harlan Pruitt's influence might intercept them before they ever reached the right hands. She wrote instead to the one authority she was fairly certain lay beyond his reach, the Regional Maritime Insurance Commission in the port city 2 days south, whose entire purpose was to investigate exactly the kind of fraudulent claims Ezra Colton's law described, and who would have every reason to take a keeper's sworn record and corroborating, manifest seriously regardless of local politics. She entrusted the letter sealed and addressed with painstaking care to a fishing captain named Obadiah Ferris, the very same family who had lost husband and son to the Marguerite, a man whose weathered, sorrowful face convinced her he could be trusted with something this important, and who, once she explained in careful, measured words what she believed the documents proved about his own family's loss, agreed without a moment's hesitation to carry the letter south himself on his next run, rather than risk it to the regular mail. While she waited for word back from the commission, Delia did not remain idle or hidden away at the cottage. She began quietly to speak with the family she had identified, not accusing anyone outright, but gently sharing what fragments felt safe to share, letting old grief find new shape in the presence of someone willing to listen without flinching. Mrs. Doyle wept for a long while in her small kitchen when Delia sat with her, not from renewed sorrow alone, but from something like relief, the relief of a suspicion long carried finally being taken seriously by another living soul. The Ferris family, for their part, grew fiercely protective of Delia once Obadiah returned from his journey south with confirmation that the commission had received her letter and opened a formal inquiry. And it was a Ferris men, weathered and broad-shouldered from a lifetime on the water, who quietly made it known around the harbor that anyone troubling the young woman out at the Lighthouse Cottage would have the whole fishing fleet to answer to. Harlan Pruitt did not take the inquiry quietly. Word reached Delia, through the same channels of harbor gossip that had first brought Harlan to her door, that he was attempting to use his position on the county board to have her ownership of the cottage itself challenged and revoked, arguing through an obliging lawyer that the original auction had been improperly conducted and the property ought to revert to county control, a maneuver so transparently aimed at silencing her that even Corwin Blythe, the auctioneer who had sold her the cottage for $4 honest in front of a full crowd of witnesses, refused to support it, testifying plainly before the board that the sale had been conducted fairly and in the open. Harlan Pruitt tried next to discredit the documents themselves, claiming through his lawyer that a lighthouse keeper's private log proved nothing, and that any papers a young stranger had conveniently discovered in a wall ought to be regarded with the deepest suspicion. But the commission's investigators, once they arrived in Cormorant Point that winter, did not rely on the logbook alone. They cross-referenced Ezra Colton's dates and shipped names against the insurance company's own surviving claim files, against harbor masters' records of light outages on the very nights in question, and against banking records that showed, plainly enough for any honest eye to follow, the payments Silas Pruitt had received and quietly reinvested in the years following each wreck. The pattern Delia had first glimpsed in a dead keeper's careful handwriting held firm under every test the investigators applied to it, exactly as her father had once told her a true set of figures always would. The formal findings, when they came that February, confirmed everything Ezra Colton had written and everything Delia had suspected. Silas Pruitt had indeed conspired, across 3 separate voyages, to disable or misdirect the Cormorant Point light in order to wreck insured vessels and collect fraudulent claims, resulting in the death of 11 sailors, including Obadiah Ferris's father and elder brother and Mrs. Doyle's only son. Silas Pruitt himself was beyond the reach of earthly justice, having died some years before, but the commission's ruling stripped his estate, now controlled entirely by Harlan, of a substantial sum in restitution, to be distributed among the surviving families of the men lost, and Harlan Pruitt's own standing on the county board and within the insurance company was quietly, thoroughly dismantled, his reputation in Cormorant Point ruined not by scandal or violence, but by the plain, patient weight of the truth finally being allowed to speak. It was, Delia thought when she heard the news, exactly the kind of justice her father would have recognized and approved of, not vengeance, but simply the numbers, at long last, being made to agree with themselves. Delia used none of the restitution for herself, though the commission's investigators, impressed by the meticulous second ledger she had prepared, offered her a modest finder's compensation for the document's recovery. Instead, she asked that it be added to what the Pruitt estate owed, so that the Ferris family, the Doyles, and the other households marked by those old wrecks might see their portions made a little larger, a little more capable of mending what 18 years of quiet grief and quiet want had worn down. She kept only the cottage itself and the lighthouse standing dark above it, and in the months that followed she did what her mother had taught her to do with anything the world had written off as finished. She asked what it was for, and whether it could still be that, with help from the grateful Ferris men, and a small sum the town itself raised once the truth came out. Delia petitioned the Maritime Authority to relight the Cormorant Point beacon, arguing that even with the newer light on the far headland, a second light at Gull Point would make the treacherous inner channel safer still for the fishing fleet that was the town's entire livelihood. Her petition was granted, and by the following autumn the old lens, a replacement, since the original had long since been sold off, but a true and honest lens nonetheless, was hauled up the tower stairs and set turning once more, so that ships coming home in the evening dark could see, from far out on the water, a small steady light burning again from a cottage that had once held nothing but silence and a dead man's unanswered warning. Delia Marsh had come to Cormorant Point with $11 and nothing else in the world, and had spent 4 of them on a ruin nobody wanted, in a moment so desperate it looked, to everyone watching, like the last foolish act of a young woman with nowhere better to turn. But it was not foolishness that raised her hand at that auction, not truly. It was the same quiet inheritance her parents had given her without ever quite meaning to name it. The belief that nothing is finished just because it looks finished, that a ledger, honestly kept, will always tell the truth in the end, and that the things the world discards are so often discarded not because they are worthless, but because no one has yet taken the trouble to look twice. Behind $4 worth of peeling shingle and salt-stained shelving, Delia had found not merely an old man's hidden proof, but a debt that 18 years of silence had left unpaid, and in settling it, she had given Cormorant Point back something the sea had taken long before she ever arrived. The simple, steady knowledge of why its men had truly been lost, and a light burning again above the rocks, to make sure it never had to happen in quite that way again. She stayed on at the cottage through the years that followed, and though she never married and never grew wealthy in any way the world would easily measure, she became, in her own quiet fashion, something the town of Cormorant Point had not had before, a keeper of records nobody else thought to keep, a woman families came to when an old dispute needed an honest eye, a friend of widows and orphans who understood, better than most, what it meant to be counted worth less than nothing, and then to prove, patiently and without anger, exactly how wrong that judgment had been. Thank you for spending this evening with Delia Marsh and the quiet light of Cormorant Point. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that value often hides in the places the world has stopped looking. We'd love to know, what is a time you found worth in something or someone others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone, and we're always glad for the company. Until next time, stay close